Welcome to the Healthy Christian Leader. I'm Dwight Habermel. Come join me in the living room for some honest conversations. I'll be talking to guests about their journey with Christ through the joys, the challenges, and the messiness of leadership. There's always something to learn from someone's story, so let's get started.
Welcome to the Healthy Christian Leader Show, everybody. My name is Rachel Habermel. I'm the Operations Manager of Ministries, and I'm very pleased to be here in conversation with Dr. Richard MacGillivray. And Dr. MacGillivray, can you tell us a little bit about you and your work?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm a sort of retired psychologist. I practiced for about 40 years. I have a PhD from the University of Ottawa in clinical psychology. I have a Master's in Science in Community Clinical Psychology from Acadia University, and I have an undergrad psychology degree from St. Mary's. I was employed at the Royal Ottawa Hospital and then the Nova Scotia Hospital up until the early 90s. And when I branched out and started my own private practice, I worked with Halifax Psychological Services for a long time, and then for the last 10 years of my career, my firm did an exclusive contract with the MacGillivray psychologists. And so that's how I end up being here.
That's wonderful. That's great. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about conflict resolution in the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I understand this is something that you have a bit of experience with.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have. I started in my training in the master's degree. I had a course and practicum work in community psychology, and my particular area of interest was in around organizations that were in conflict or were dysfunctional in some sort of fashion, and I carried that on and ended up doing a fair bit of consultation. After I moved back to Nova Scotia in 1988. And so I've consulted with various organizations. Some of them are healthcare, but some of them were private sector, factories and other businesses, and quite an array of different sort of places with quite different types of conflict going on. So I have kind of a little of this and a little of that.
Wonderful. Well, that's good.
Yeah.
And my first question is, I guess, very, very simple and basic, but it's a good thing to clarify first. What does conflict resolution mean in the context of the workplace and organizational structures, be they churches or businesses or nonprofits?
Right.
What does that term mean?
Well, conflict resolution is an idea that grows out of the sense that conflict isn't always a good thing or a productive thing. Mm-hmm. Conflict in and of itself need not be a problem, because sometimes it's just a matter of disagreement, and it can actually end up being beneficial for the organization to have some conflict if it's well managed. The problem is that conflict often isn't well managed. And back when I was in my training, I became acquainted with something called the ecological theory or ecological model of how organizations work. It was a guy named James Kelly who'd come up with this notion that if we look at organizations, we have to look at how they work as sort of an interdependent organism, how people work together, how they adapt to things that come up, how they utilize the resources, and how they work through what was referred to as succession, which basically means, do you evolve to meet new challenges or new characteristics of the organization? And usually, if you want to determine whether there's a problem in an organization, there's usually a problem, a breakdown somewhere in there. You can see that, in the interdependence, are people actually working well together? Are people communicating with each other? Are they solving problems effectively together? Are they adapting, and are they to challenges? Because most organizations have challenges. There are good adaptations, there are maladaptations too. Cycling of resources, is the talent being used? Are we hearing from the talent? Is the talent staying, or are they moving on? And also, I saw a movie recently where they said the problem isn't what has happened, the problem is what are we going to do next.
Right, yeah.
And in every organization, it's true, we don't sit on our laurels. We don't reflect necessarily on what we did last time right.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, what do we do with the next challenge? Because the next challenge is coming, if your organization is vibrant at all.
Yeah.
So we kind of look at it, or I look at it at least, from that sort of perspective. And when you look at it that way, what you tend to find out that the problems usually most obviously crop up in one of two main things. One is how people communicate, and the other is how people think and how they frame the nature of the problem in their own minds. And that's usually where I end up working.
That's really interesting. Well, and you've already touched on the second question I was going to ask you.
Okay.
And that's, when a conflict's come to the point of being visible in the workplace, we see it, but where do most of those conflicts start? Is there a common root to them? And it sounds like maybe that communication and mental framing is part of that. Yeah.
For sure. I think oftentimes the first sense you have that there's something going on in your organization is that there is some expressed or felt level of frustration among people who are members of the organization. This is just at a really basic level.
Sure.
People stop being happy.
Yeah.
And so you see it in different ways. Sometimes that's communicated. I mean, that's the obvious thing. If somebody sitting at their desk and suddenly blows up to somebody on the telephone or somebody that they're working with, that's obvious.
Right.
What also happens is people stop talking to each other, or they talk to some people in the organization and not other people in the organization. It depends a lot on the nature of the problem, but generally those kinds of things give you a clue that something is going on. There are other sort of more macro or gross kind of signs that there are conflict, increased absenteeism. People start leaving the organization. When that starts happening, you realize you've got a fairly serious, undetected problem.
That makes sense, yeah.
Okay.
No, that's very interesting. Well, and conflicts come in all sorts of, shapes and sizes.
Right.
When I was thinking about the conversation we were going to have today, I was kind of thinking through some of the conflicts I've encountered recently, and one that came to mind was a very simple one, but a couple weekends ago, I was going to have brunch with my sister on a Saturday morning, and we were going to go over to her house and make brunch and everything. And she calls me in the morning and says, "Oh, I don't know what I'm going to make, and maybe you can decide, maybe you can pick stuff up." And I ended up getting quite short with her on the phone and kind of rude and hung up kind of abruptly. And when I left that conversation, I was thinking, okay, was that a justified response to her being a little bit disorganized? But okay, probably not. And I've just ruined brunch because, who wants to go to brunch with someone who's rude to them on the phone? And I recognized that I'd just come out of a really stressful work week where I'd felt like, the people I was working with on projects weren't, picking up their weight with things. And I felt like I had to kind of compensate. And I had kind of built this narrative in my mind that I have to pick up the pieces when other people aren't pulling their weight. And so when I got on the phone with my sister and she said, "Oh, what do you think? I haven't really decided." All of a sudden this kind of triggered this thought that, oh, this is the position I'm put in, which is obviously not a fair thing to project on her at all. And I reached out right away and apologized for that. But it helped me think about the fact that, what we're arguing about is often not really what we're upset about. Can you speak a little bit to that idea? Right.
No, I think that's very true. And oftentimes those are the first manifestations of something which is perhaps even unrelated to the initial thing. But you're describing something which is kind of interesting in and of itself, which is something called decision fatigue. Decisions take energy. They take work. And even when we end up doing that for a living, a lot of careers involve decision making or some decision making process. There's only so many you can make.
Sure.
Until you start getting tired of the decisions that you're trying to make, or you're just being asked to make another decision. And what we know from the research is that we tend to make more simplistic decisions when we do that. We just, the first thing that comes to mind. And so, And so you don't actually look at the whole issue of your sister suggesting, well, I'm not sure what to make, and could you pick up some things on the way over, which at face value seems a perfectly reasonable thing to suggest,
definitely.
because she just couldn't make up her mind what to have. But you weren't ready for yet another decision.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that you're kind of caught up in what's been happening all week and not so much what she is saying.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you reflected on it, you found that she was being quite reasonable. Now, it might have happened that she was being unreasonable. I mean, if she had made some sort of other thing, like, could you cook a chicken and bring it over?
Yeah.
Or something like that. Even though that's a perfectly good thing to say, no, I won't do that in some nice sort of way, you still have to be able to kind of understand where she's coming from. You have to look at your options and so forth to come up with that, and your brain gets kind of tired of that. And that's what decision fatigue is. It's a small thing in the conflict resolution business, but it does show up, especially when you're negotiating. Like if you're at a disagreement with somebody overtly where you're trying to find a solution, the longer those things tend to stretch out, the poorer the quality of the decisions that get made.
Interesting.
So there's that part of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Are there ways to avoid decision fatigue?
Well, I think one of the things that needs to happen is that everybody involved in a conflict has to know that they're in a conflict. You know, if your sister says this to you, you could say, you know, it would be better if you had said, I have made so many decisions this week, I don't want another one.
Right.
So we can have crackers and jam if you like, but I'm gonna leave that to you.
Right.
Unless you can think of something for me to pick up, call me and let me know. So in other words, you can kind of identify what it is that you're feeling and what you need here. One of the real things that we notice happens in conflict, one of the characteristics I think that I think I've seen in almost every place that I've worked in conflict resolution, is that people stop listening. They don't listen to each other. And there is no way to resolve a conflict if you don't understand the position of the other person you're in conflict with. And that you see this in politicians on TV. You see this in every walk of life, that people are venting about their unhappiness about the conflict or whatever the issue might be, without fully understanding what the other person wants. I used to work with a gentleman named Keith Thompson, passed away a couple of years ago, and he gave an excellent example of two men who each want an orange, but they've only got one orange. So how are we going to do this? And so what they finally decided is they would cut the orange in half and each would have the orange, which at face value seems like a reasonable solution.
Sure.
Except that one of the gentlemen peels his half of the orange and eats the fruit and throws the peeling away. The other gentleman gets one of those things that you make orange rind with. He uses the rind because he wants to make a zest for something he is preparing, and he throws the fruit away. If they understood each other, they could have each had a whole orange. But we fail to see possible resolutions to conflict because we are not aware of what the other person actually needs. And when we start to listen for what people actually need, the conflict gets reconstructed really in a really interesting way. One of the best examples I can think of, it's a political one, but it's an old one. It was Anwar Sadat, who was the president of Egypt. Egypt and Israel had been fighting for years. And Israel occupied a large part of Egyptian territory. When he initiated a peace initiative with Menachem Begin, who was the president of Israel, what they realized is what Israel wanted was recognition of itself as a country and a viable peace treaty. What Egypt wanted was restoration of its occupied lands. They actually weren't mutually exclusive at all. They made a peace treaty which has endured now for 50 some odd years.
Wow.
There hasn't been a gunshot across the Egyptian-Israeli border since that time. Because I think oftentimes in conflict, because people stop listening and they don't understand what the other side needs, and whether or not that might actually work with their own needs. There also is a tendency, and here we get into the cognition, the way that people think in conflict. There is a tendency to see the other side as more extreme than they are. There's a good deal of research to support that idea. And there's also a tendency to attribute to them sort of nasty or nefarious characteristics. So much so that we know that sometimes people will turn down good resolutions to conflict because they've decided that the speaker is a bad guy. So those are some of the things that that you're kind of up against. So
yeah, that's really interesting. And it sounds like listening is really a key to healthy conflict resolution.
Yes.
How can we listen more effectively in conflict when, like you say, maybe we're kind of spinning this narrative that, oh, you're the bad guy because you're the opposition and everything. How can we sort of shut down some of those mechanisms and actually listen intentionally?
Well, that's a good question. Most of the times that I got involved, people weren't listening horribly well at all. So my role was to be, I was the person in the room who didn't have a dog in this fight.
Sure, yeah.
So I could play the kind of, I could play the listener in a sense, or to model the listener to them. In a way, I sometimes thought I was a bit like a ping pong table that people bounce their messages to one another off of, and found out, hopefully through the process, that they were not incompatible. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, that they're always going to agree. You might find a situation where, no, they're just not compatible. People don't have to agree in order for there to be good conflict resolution. We don't have to walk away from the table with agreement. What we can walk away from the table with is an understanding that the process was fair. There was no way to satisfy everybody. But if people feel that they've been heard and that they have been they've been able to articulate their stake in the decision,
sure,
and come up with something that works as well as it can, sometimes that's a good outcome from conflict. And sometimes people have to agree, well, the other side might have a better point.
Right, yeah.
And that's not a bad outcome. But to go back to your point, I think when we listen, one of the things is that in order to listen, you need to stop talking.
That's a very good point, yes.
So I do think it's really important to have as your goal, and I always counseled people in this way in conflict, when you're in this conversation, if we're going to be doing some sort of conflict resolution, is one of your objectives has to be to make sure you clearly understand the other person's point of view and articulate that back to that person. It's almost like, Carl Rogers, reflective listening. So you're saying this, okay, so this is what you would see, or this is what you're feeling through this.
Right.
Check and make sure, don't assume.
Right.
Assumptions get us in all kinds of trouble. Assumptions, in my business, we call them heuristics. They're just shortcuts we take in thinking, which can be efficient, but they can create undetected problems. We assume we know what the other person wants before they say it. So it's a good idea to adopt a kind of active listening, checking, making sure that you understand fully, because if you don't understand fully, as I said before, there's no way you're going to be able to resolve it, because you're going to be solving the wrong problem. So that's one of the things. The other thing is to try to make sure that the other person understands your perspective.
That's interesting, yeah.
So kind of cycle back to it, try to ask the person, do you see what I mean, types of questions. Or could you see how me or the people I'm associated with might have interpreted that?
Right.
Or might have got that wrong, or might feel if that comes about. And it's a very, very active process. Communication is a very active process. If you're not doing something, you're not listening.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need to be engaged even when you're not speaking. So those are important steps.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it sounds like not talking is important.
That's right.
And really engaging in what's being said.
That's right.
And making sure that you're not working from assumptions, but you're actually able to articulate what you feel like you're hearing to
Yes.
kind of allow them to fact check you a little bit. And maybe encouraging them to do the same, right? Reiterating what it is you're saying and encouraging them to kind of give confirmation that, you know,
Yeah.
they're on the same page and they're actually hearing your intention.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a few basic rules that also help, and I always advise people, this goes back even to work I've done as a clinician with individual conflict management, like couples, families, those kind of things, which is, there's a couple of don'ts that you
Sure.
should use. And one of the big don'ts is, don't use imprecise language. So say what you want, don't swear. Sometimes people swear, sometimes they think it's a way of breaking the ice or emphasizing something. The problem is that if you swear, people are free to take that any way they like. And that's not what you want. You want them to understand it how you're saying it. Don't raise your voice. Don't cross over into the space between you and the other person.
Like physically?
Yes. So for example, the way we're sitting, the people watching this can probably tell that we are fairly comfortable. And we don't look aggressive.
Right.
Without even knowing, if you turn the volume down on your TV, you're going to know we're not in conflict. So how do you know we're not in conflict? Because we're sitting back.
Right.
My hands, well, you know, I talk with my hands.
Yeah.
My hands are open. And you're in a relaxed posture, leaning back as well, and you're nodding,
Right.
which is a conversational encourager,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So people can see by looking at us, if I was to cross into the space, they're going to read that very differently. If I put my hands into the space, now if I do it like this, that's fine. But if I do this,
Right. Yeah.
okay. So these are, unfortunately, they're non-specific. If I do those things, you're free to take them any way you like. And that may even mean that you go back into things that are in your memory bank that upset you, that may have nothing to do with me.
Right.
If you had a teacher in school who was very intimidating or something like that and was always doing this kind of thing. Not to say anything bad about teachers, but
Sure.
I have family members who'd have a word with me if I did that.
Yeah.
But so it's very important. And the thing is, you and I could be sitting like this, and we could be disagreeing quite strongly. I saw a very interesting photograph one time of Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union at the time, the two most powerful people in the world and the most deadly of enemies. And they're at a meeting. And they're sitting in recliner rockers with their feet up on chairs. They look like the oldest pals in the world.
Yeah.
Now, you know, they're talking about nuclear disarmament.
Yeah.
But it was and the chairs, by the way, were identical. Nobody gets an advantage. And what it does, just posturally, creates an atmosphere that they can have constructive conflict.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I feel like often some of the things you're talking about, using, language, swearing or kind of intrusive body language or raising your voice, some
Right.
people might think it's a way of getting their point across.
Right.
Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. I think it's a good way not to get your point across.
Okay, yeah.
I think it's a good way to cloud the issue with personal animosity and defensiveness. Human beings are wired to react badly to loud voices. Infants will cry at a barking dog or at a train in the distance at night because we are hardwired to be frightened of loud sounds. So if you raise your voice, you trigger other things besides your point in the person you're talking to. And so that's why it makes good sense to talk calmly. And some of the best conflict managers that I've worked with, and I've worked with a lot of good managers in the different organizations, they tended to be very calm and very precise in what they said. They said what they meant.
Right.
So that the person would be dealing with the information they wanted them to deal with. Good communication consists of the person receiving the message you want them to receive from you, that you're trying to send to them, and you to make sure you receive the message they're trying to send. If you get that, it doesn't matter if you agree or not, it's still communication.
Right.
And then you can actually work on something that might resolve whatever the conflict is. And as I said before, if you do this in a relaxed and respectful way and elicit a good understanding, even if you don't agree, people tend to go away reasonably happy that at least they've been heard.
Right.
At least they're understood.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We have about 1 minute left here, and I wonder if you can briefly speak to how can we address conflicts before they arise? How can we work to diffuse tensions?
Okay. I think that the idea of listening and opening up communication can be a value that organizations, churches, schools, hospitals, factories, that they can aspire to, that they can actually work on from the beginning. And sometimes this comes from the top down, that it has to be demonstrated. But that you are open and that you make sure that you encourage it. Sometimes people say they want to be open and then they punish what they hear.
Right.
And it backfires. But I think you can have that as a governing ethic in the company that you're with or the organization that you're involved in.
Right. That's excellent. Thank you very much. This has been fantastic. And we're going to continue with a second conversation, so please stay tuned for that. And Dr. Richard MacGillivray, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Well, today's conversation was fantastic, but we're not finished yet. We'll be back in the next video with the same guest with more discussion about leader health. You know the drill. Subscribe and hit that bell. Would you join us for the next episode? You can find new episodes every week in video form on the Aaron Ministry YouTube page and in audio form as the Healthy Christian Leader Show wherever you get your podcasts. Aaron Ministries is an interdenominational network of friends in ministry with a mission to foster healthy Christian leaders. Check out our website, aaronministries.com, for more resources and information on how to donate or to start a healthy Christian leader gathering in your area. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.